Let's begin with a little discussion about the Cotton Bowl, where number one Alabama is entering, trying to do something, not just in this game, but in this college football playoff that it has not accomplished since 2012. Because while Nick Saban has been rolling off national championships at Alabama, the Tide have not gone back-to-back since the 2011 and 2012 season. Very hard to win a national championship, very hard to win two of them in a row, and that's what they're going to be doing here. Now, Cincinnati, of course, makes a ton of history as it enters the game as the first team from outside the group of five to be able to make the college football playoff. The Bearcats are 2-touchdown underdogs. Alabama and Will Anderson is saying, we got that underdog mentality. Nobody ever believed in us. And I guess I wanted to start with a general feeling about the matchup, like, because there's some other extraneous topics that I think are important, not only just to this game, but to the Georgia-Michigan game as well. But when you first saw this matchup revealed on the selection show, or when we knew it was pretty much going to be Alabama-Cincinnati, but where do these teams fit against each other in ways that kind of stand out to you as significant?
So I do think Cincinnati's defense is legitimately for real. You do have this weird thing, and I don't know if you guys listen to like analytics podcasts and whatnot. There is this kind of concept that like when you have two really good defenses going against each other, bet the over pretty reliably because a lot of defense is tied to who you played slightly more so than offense is. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it seems to track. But I do think Cincinnati has played some good offenses, and I think they legitimately have a good number of professional players there on their defense. To me, this game is going to come down to, do you actually believe in Desmon Ridder? Obviously, I don't, because I had that preseason bet with Tom that he would not be a first-round pick, as well as Malik Willis. I don't really love Cincinnati's offense. We'll see how well. Of course, we're going to see how well they're going to play. They're going to play the game, but I think Cincinnati's defense has a chance to give Alabama some trouble here. I just don't know if the offense can hold up its end of the bargain.
What do you guys think?
Pretty much in line with that. I do think that, I think the key area here for Cincinnati in this matchup is going to be its secondary against those Alabama receivers. And I think that Cincinnati has a couple of NFL guys in its secondary, which will help them. It's just, I think that they're strong on the defensive line. I think they've got good linebackers. The question is, and what we're going to find out in this game is, are they strong enough to go against an offense with the kind of size and strength and speed and athleticism that Alabama has for 60 minutes? Because while the Bearcats have been great all season long, they haven't really played a lot of Alabamas. So that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. But I do think that they have talented players. I do think that they're a team that could surprise people in this one and make it more competitive, kind of like what we saw last season when they played Georgia in the bowl game. I mean, I thought in that game they were going to get steamrolled, and they held up pretty well. But as you know, Bud has talked about on the show all season long, and we've talked about a little bit, I feel like last year's Cincinnati team was better than this year's Cincinnati team. So I don't know if that's going to be the case again, but I do think that this is just, it's really easy to look at this matchup and be like, oh, David versus Goliath. And, while David wins in the story, it doesn't usually work out that way in real life. But I don't think of Cincinnati really as a David. I just think of it as a very good team that's in a David conference, if that makes sense. So it's going to be an interesting matchup. It's going to come down to whether they can cover the receivers. If somebody can keep Jamison Williams from getting behind them too many times is really what it's going to be.
John Mechie could be a big loss. I mean, that one down guy is going to make it a little bit easier. I'm torn on this one because I look at and I think both teams are kind of similar. Like, both have played down to some competition at various times, but then at their best, we saw what Bama did against Georgia, and we saw what Cincinnati did against Notre Dame. But I don't think I think they were still kind of struggling in the offensive line. They weren't quite full strength when they played that game. Not to take away from what Cincinnati did. Desmon Ridder played great in that game. They did have Kyle Hamilton in the secondary, so they were going against, a really talented player. But like, of all the games that I look at from Miami's schedule, because they struggled against Auburn, they struggled against LSU, they struggled against Florida, and they struggled against Texas A&M. But like, does Cincinnati resemble those teams? I don't think so. Like, I think Cincinnati kind of resembles Miami. And if that's what you're going to get, like, good luck.
We saw that game.
Yeah, but but Miami's secondary is not as good as Cincinnati. So like, I'm torn. I honestly do not have a pick yet in this game, but I do think that Cincinnati's secondary is better than Georgia's. You know, like, they've got a couple NFL guys on there. I just wonder if Bama can push around Cincinnati. Like, they could not, because they didn't push around Auburn. They didn't put, again, those like the bigger boys of the SEC, they didn't push around. So I don't know. I'm torn on this one.
You know, I think it's an interesting concept, Danny, because it's a different conversation on both sides of the ball, right? Teams did give this Bama defense last year, or earlier this year, some trouble. And I don't want to make it seem like I don't think Cincinnati can score at all. Cincinnati moved the ball pretty effectively on Houston, which is coordinated by Doug Belk, who is a Saban disciple, right? So like the last game we saw the Cincinnati team play, how did they do it? They used a lot of motion. They ran some of their split stuff. They attacked them at different levels. And you know, this Bama defense, they have Will Anderson. They don't have the best corners in the world. And sometimes their linebackers in coverage, especially toe-to-toe, have been exposed. Now, Georgia failed to do a lot of that there in the SEC title game, and Bama had some good answers for them. So a lot of this just comes down to, you know, can Ridder play at a really high level, and can the offensive line hold up and find ways to neutralize Will Anderson enough? Because he's really that one difference maker for them. But you don't want to have to use too many resources to neutralize him. Otherwise, you're saying, hey, we're gonna double Will Anderson all the time, and then all of a sudden we're gonna win how many one-on-ones against Bama or one-on-twos in certain situations? I would run Ridder a lot in this game. I think his legs have, and that's not. I don't normally believe like, hey, to beat Bama you have to have the mobile quarterback. The stuff I found is like typically you have to have a dude on the outside who can win one-on-ones, because Bama really challenges you to play NFL ball and to beat them in one-on-one matchups. But I don't know that Cincinnati can move the ball well enough if Ridder's legs aren't prominently featured, and then also a legitimate threat that is established that Cincinnati has to, or that Bama has to account for.
Yeah, and that's the thing too you just touched on there, because like Alec Pierce is a very good receiver for the Bearcats, but he's
looks great
not
with his shirt off.
Looks great with his shirt off. He's a good athlete, but he's not an elite athlete. You know what I mean? And I don't know, like, he's a guy who can use his body. He positions himself well. He high points the ball. He can, you know, he's very good in traffic, kind of, you know, winning jump balls and all that kind of stuff. But he's not really the kind of receiver that you worry about just absolutely killing guys and getting wide open, and especially going against, you know, upper echelon defenses and athletes and other players. So that is a concern for me too. So I agree. I think Ridder's legs are going to be huge for the Bearcats in this game. And I think Jerome Ford's going to be huge for the Bearcats in this game, because I think that part of your approach, if you're Cincinnati in this game and you want to try to pull off this upset, like Danny, you were talking about, do they have the defense that could, you know, give Alabama's offensive line problems? I think they have good players. I worry about their size. Like, I don't know if they're quite big enough. So I think that your best strategy going forward in this game is probably going to be to keep the Alabama offense off the field as much as possible and try to control the tempo. That's not to say you don't want to get bogged down in the run game, because if you do that, you're just going to
face third and long and die every single time.
Yeah, you're going to find yourself in horrible situations and then having to chase. But it's going to be important for them to find that kind of balance between Ford and Ridder to keep Alabama's defense honest.
So this has stood out to me a lot when trying to break down this game. Alabama's offensive line, I believe, played its best game of the season against Georgia. Considering the opponent, considering the performance, that was the best thing that you had. And Nick Saban talked about, you know, motivation. We really challenged this group to answer the call and to step up. And they did. But we've also got lots and lots of examples from throughout this season, whether it be an entire game, whether it be a key stretch. We've got performances, close calls against LSU, close calls against Auburn, times where this Alabama offensive line has gotten some of the disrespect and the doubters and all the haters that are out there that seem to have this Crimson Tide team motivated, as they are going through media availability, trying to declare themselves the underdog in the college football playoff as the number 1 overall seed and the defending national champion with the greatest coach of all time on the sidelines. But I do wonder if you are Cincinnati's defensive front, and I do agree that I think Cincinnati, particularly on the defensive line, was better last year. Secondary is mostly the same. I mean, you still had Sauce Gardner, still had Kobe Bryant. So that would be one spot where I do think that Cincinnati was better last year. But if I'm defensive coordinator, if I'm the defensive coordinator of Cincinnati, which is, I believe, a Tressel, right? Mike?
I'm not sure. I
Mike?
think so, yeah.
Yeah, Denbrock and Tressel, I think, are our 2 assistants. And Luke Fickell, of course, a defensive background coach. If you're putting together your game plan here, there's a lot of tape on being able to show what you can do. For LSU, we say it was a little bit of surprise, like all that like zero, like blitz heavy type stuff. But what can you take from that? Now, Auburn had a different game plan, but one that was also pretty effective in limiting what Alabama's offense could do. I think that Alabama's offensive line has been inconsistent enough throughout the entire season, and that Cincinnati might not be the unique motivating factor that Jordan Davis and Nakobe Dean and the Georgia defense might be, and that whatever that little extra oomph is, it might be really tough to channel that. But that only allows Cincinnati to hang close. And again, I'm not going to put in my pick here, but the ways that Cincinnati, I think, wins this game has to be with Desmond Ridder limiting the just back-breaking mistakes and a defense that is going to be able to prevent Alabama from really getting into the kind of rhythm from in the passing game that allows them to set up the splash plays. And so if Cincinnati can win those early downs, and if Cincinnati can get some pressure on Bryce Young, and if Alabama's offensive line doesn't hold up like it has done it several times throughout the season, I kind of see that as like the whether this ends up being a low scoring Alabama wins, but Cincinnati's keeping it interesting, or whether this thing goes totally sideways, to me kind of depends on when Alabama's offense is going up against Cincinnati's defense.
I think, too, the other thing that probably didn't get enough credit, Alabama's offensive line was good, but the design, like that to me looked like the first game that Alabama was like, we're not going to be able to hold the ball all day. We better get it out. I mean, that ball was out. I mean, it was coming out quick. If you went and look at the release times, Bryce Young was not holding it quick or for very long. And I think that was by design. That's why I think Bill O'Brien deserves a ton of credit for the game plan as well. I think Cincinnati's going to have to get a little exotic, like bring more looks, bring more pressures, because where I don't think they're going to have success is trying to rush with 4 and drop with 7. You know, you're just not, that's where I don't think they have the personnel to do that. But I do think one of the things they could challenge with the secondary they have is be a little bit more aggressive with your guys on the outside. Say, hey, we'll get up and bump you. We'll throw off some of that timing where you're going to have to get rid of it quick because we're going to have a guy coming free, and then you got to challenge them, and they have to win some of those battles on the outside. Like you cannot, I think, wasn't it Ohio State last year where Devontae Smith took one little 5-yard hitch almost and turned it up for a touchdown. Like you cannot have one of those, which is why I do think the first quarter and a half is vital for Cincinnati or any Alabama opponent kind of to hold on for dear life, or else it'll turn into Notre Dame national championship game. And once you're down too much, then I think that's where panic sets in on both sides of the ball. You start pressing and it's kind of too late.
And yeah, that's one thing too. We're probably going to know pretty early. Cincinnati is second in the country in pressure rate at 38.2%. So that just means it gets pressure on quarterbacks 38.2% of the time they drop back. It's a very complicated statistic, but that's the second highest rate in the country. And if we see in the first couple possessions, if they're not getting to Bryce Young, it's going to be a long day, because that's part of the reason Gardner and Bryant have had such amazing seasons. It's a lot easier to cover when you only have to cover for a couple seconds. And if they're not getting that kind of pressure on Young, and Alabama's allowed to take its time, and Jamison Williams is allowed to get, if you give Jamison Williams 3 seconds to beat you, Jamison Williams is going to beat you. So that's going to be a huge factor, and that's definitely something to watch early.
I think the one thing I'll be watching for is explosiveness on early downs. Both Cincinnati's defense in particular is really damn good on passing downs. Now, part of that's because I think some of the quarterbacks they've faced, but they really are top 5 in almost every stat category you can look at when they get you to, 2nd and 8 plus, 3rd and 5 plus. So can Alabama, hit those play action shots over the top to get on those guys early? Conversely, I do not trust Cincinnati's drop back game in those situations. So Cincinnati, for as much as we think they need to hold the ball, and I do obviously somewhat, their explosiveness probably has to come on those early downs via some play action concepts. And it'll come down to, can their offensive line, which I don't think is as good as it was last year, can that hold up against Bama's pass rush or against Bama's, some run blitzes or early downs where you're play action these guys, you're trying to get over the top, you're trying to create some explosives. To me, that'll probably be the deciding factor. If Cincinnati can't hit those explosive plays, I don't have a whole lot of confidence that they can, convert 3rd and 7 consistently and drive the field and hang in it.
That's a funny thing you bring up, because you talk about their offensive line. Looking at the same stat for pressure allowed,
their pressure rate, yeah,
they're 6th according to PFF in the country. You know who's 93rd?
Is it Cincinnati?
Bama.
Or Bama?
Alabama. Yep.
Yeah. There's a weird split here, though, Tom, if you look at it. So they're 123rd on blitz down success rate offensively. So, like, when they get in those bad situations, somehow they're not registering as allowing pressures. I've been looking at this, but they're 68th in passing down sack rate allowed. So to me, that says how good is Ridder moving around in the pocket, and then also, how well do those receivers get open? There's some weird stuff going on there, because 3rd in pressure rate is incredible.
Yeah, because their pressure rate, like I said, is 6. But to your point, sack rate, they're 35th.
Yeah.
So it's like, so a lot of it's got to be on Ridder just not getting rid of the ball.
That's my thought too.
Interesting. So before we get into the strangest and most uncontrollable aspect of the entire college football playoff, I'm going to say that I'm probably more intrigued than enthused about the first game. I think that like y'all said, the first quarter can have me ratcheting up my energy level, but because of Alabama's experience, and I apologize if I've said this too many times, but I just see Alabama against Washington, Alabama against Michigan State, Alabama against Kelly Bryant-led Clemson. Those games were not fantastic Alabama wins, but there was never really a doubt that Alabama was going to end up winning that game. The other team just did not have the skill players in the offense to be able to by any chance threaten to score. Clemson, obviously, with the quarterback. I would say Jake Browning's probably also the quarterback. Michigan State probably with the skill players. But that's probably my read here. Or where's the intrigue, enthusiasm, excitement level for all y'all for the Cotton Bowl?
Excitement on a scale of 1 to 10 is probably a 6. Intrigue is about a 7.5.
I mean, it's a playoff game, right? I mean, you got, like we're talking about players opting out of stuff. I'm all in. I don't think it brings as much excitement as the Orange Bowl does, but it's up there. By the way, Alabama trying to be the underdog is kind of like Tim Tebow. No one believed in me when I was coming out of high school line. Like, he was the most heavily recruited player in the country, and everyone was lining up for him. You can tell yourself that all you want. It's just not the reality of what's going on. I think it's kind of funny, though.
But elite athletes do that somehow.
Yeah,
they do. You're right.
Like Tom Brady still motivates himself somehow based on that draft nonsense.
Yep. He does.
What about you, Bud? Well, ultimately, like, sort of final thought on the intrigue or enthusiasm for the early kick.
I'm pretty excited for it, to be honest. I think there's still some flaws in this Bama team. The 12 games prior to the game they played against Georgia, they still count. And I think the adjustments they made against Georgia matter the most, obviously, but like, those games still happen. And I want to see, can Cincinnati hang in better than, I don't know, like 2015 Michigan State did, or that Washington team did, or, the Oklahoma team that got blasted by Bama. That's kind of what I'm going to judge them on. Like, do they belong? And if they show me more than that, awesome. But Bama's beating these teams, like you guys said, routinely by 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 scores.
Yeah, it's because Bama can play its B- game and win. I'm like, okay, let's see what happens out here.